Well, here we are. Pleasant afternoon, summer afternoon. Mr. Cat, the producer, somewhere. Look, by the time you see this, the 26th of January will come and go on. I mean, 26th of January is a number of things that can be described as Invasion Day, Survival Day, Australia Day, and just in case you didn't know, it's Indian Independence Day. Now obviously the 26th of January marks the day that a penal colony was established by Britain, initially at Port Jackson, initially at Botany Bay and then Port Jackson. It began the colonisation process, which continues to have a devastating impacts on First Nations people. But unfortunately, the struggle for truth-telling and treaty is dead in the water. The failure of the voice referendum has put back the process by at least 2 generations. Now, the disappointing part of the voice referendum wasn't the fact that Australians voted no, considering the campaign which accompanied the voice referendum with the disinformation, misinformation and falsehoods. I expected that. But the disappointing aspect was the division within the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community. Now obviously, like any community, there are different points of view. But unfortunately, most people within First Nations community and within this Australian society had no real understanding of the impact it would have on the momentum towards truth-telling and treaty at a federal level. Now I know there are a number of states which are pursuing treaties with registered Aboriginal parties, initially in Victoria, now in South Australia. But again, these treaties will not have the same force and impact as a federal treaty, federal truth-telling. So what happened? Why is it such a disaster? All political struggle is based on momentum. The momentum for gay marriage took decades to create. The successful plebiscite means the government, theoretically in a democratic society, having to follow the will of the people, legislate. The dilemma with the voice referendum, the loss of the voice referendum, is that no government at the federal level, whether it's the Liberal Party or ALP, none of the major parties will ever enter into negotiations regarding a treaty or truth-telling at a national level with First Nations people, because it is political death because of the failure of the referendum. Now, many activists who encourage people to vote no seem to have misunderstood what this was all about. A treaty is a negotiation and an agreement between sovereign states, whether that sovereign nation state is the state of Australia or whether that sovereign state is a First Nations sovereign people, is irrelevant. It is a piece of paper between the government of the day, which is a sovereign nation, which represents a sovereign nation state, and another sovereign nation state. A referendum is a decision which is made by the people. As we saw with Brexit, when that referendum succeeded, things changed. The British government was forced to respond. The failure of the voice referendum means that any activity towards treaty and truth-telling at a federal level is doomed to fail. And even at a state level where negotiations are continuing, especially in Victoria, that agreement can be torn apart by a Conservative government because it doesn't have the force of a referendum. Governments make legislation, and during these public interest before corporate interest presentations we talk about government legislation ad nauseam. And obviously government make legislation based on a number of factors. The power of the 1% that own the means of production, distribution, exchange, and the will of the people. And that will of the people in a parliamentary democracy like Australia can only be incorporated via a referendum. Legislation changes. Government legislation is based on the constitutional arrangements which determine how or what legislation governments can put in place. And that's the role of the High Court, to determine what is constitutional and what isn't constitutional. But a referendum bypasses the parliamentary process. It incorporates in the constitutional arrangements a framework which cannot be removed by the Parliament of the day. That was the purpose of a voice to Parliament incorporated in the Australian Constitution. So we are now faced, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, with the problem of how to once again create the momentum for change. And that is a huge issue, a huge problem, when 60% of Australians voted no in the referendum for a variety of reasons. It's a huge hurdle to jump. So what can we do? Well, obviously some people will continue to be involved in reactive politics, reacting to government legislation. But the best way to recreate momentum is through practical truth-telling. Now, practical truth-telling is what the Tanaminoa Maulboyheenner commemoration was all about on the 20th of January. Now, for some time, the Tanaminoa Maulboyheenner Commemoration Committee has raised the issue of Tanaminoa Maulboyheenner, two Tasmanian men who were hung on the 20th of January 1842 for resisting white colonisation. As we know, Australia, in the first 50 years, the east coast of Australia was colonised by gentlemen of name and quality. And they had three important advantages. One, genocide. Genocide meant that the land was cleared of First Nations people. That meant that grants of land could be given to gentlemen of name and quality. At the same time, the fact that New South Wales was a penal colony, and I'm talking about the period between 1788 and 1846, meant the gentlemen of name and quality had free labour. So the axis of Australian colonisation was genocide, free land and free labour. Three very important elements. So how do we recreate that momentum? In the 21st century, a century of facts are irrelevant, where social media has gained ascendancy, and where artificial intelligence, which obviously is an oxymoron, is becoming more and more important. It's becoming increasingly difficult to enter debates and influence people, especially when it comes to constitutional change. So one way the Tannaminawau Maulboyheenner Commemoration Committee has looked at this task is through bringing that story to people's attention through a yearly commemoration and through a decade-long struggle which saw the first monument to the Frontier Wars being erected in a major capital city in Melbourne in 2016. Now, the importance of their execution was the fact that this was the British government's response to armed resistance to the colonisation process. This wasn't genocide through smallpox-encrusted blankets, poison flour, or men, women and children were hacked to death in the dark, as we saw in the Mile Creek massacre in 1836. This was the British government's response to their armed resistance to colonisation. Judge Willis, the Supreme Court judge from New South Wales, had come down to Melbourne to establish a branch of the New South Wales Supreme Court, because Victoria at that particular point in time was part of the New South Wales penal colony, stated, although the jury had asked for mercy, stated this was not about vengeance. The hanging was about creating fear. Creating fear among First Nations people. The interesting thing about Tannaminawau Maulboyheenner's resistance, the resistance of the Party of Five, Tannaminawau, Planobina, Maulboyheenner, Putirana and Truganini, was the fact they were Tasmanians. They were the survivors of 33-year war, which began in 1803 and ended in 1836 in Tasmania, where 326 survivors of that war were transported to Flinders Island, and within 3 years that number had decreased to 89, 17 of which came across to Melbourne to civilise the Victorian blacks. So these people spoke English, they understood English law, they understood guns, they understood colonisation. They had been the victims of colonisation. In that 33-year war, a population of 20,000 was reduced to 326. So these stories are important, but stories can be changed. Stories can be misconstrued. Disinformation is rife. So one way of overcoming this is what the Tannaminawau Maulboyheenner Commemoration Committee was all about. It was about forcing, encouraging the Melbourne City Council to build that monument at Tannaminawau Maulboyheenner. This is a permanent reminder to the people who visit the monument about what occurred. This is practical truth-telling. Everywhere we look, there are memorials to Australians who have died fighting in the majority of cases, fighting other people's wars in other lands. But there are very few, far and between, there are very few memorials to the frontier wars. There's no memorial to the frontier wars in the Australian War Memorial. And apart from a number of ceremonies across the country, most of the hundreds of thousands of men, women and children that died in the colonisation process, and their descendants who continue to suffer because of that process, there are no permanent reminders. We may see a television show, hear a story, see a discussion, debate, an argument on social media, but there are no permanent monuments. This is one way of overcoming the disaster that has occurred as far as truth-telling and treaty is concerned with the failure of the voice referendum. So ultimately, what you do does influence what happens. In the 21st century, because of the monolithic nature of government and corporations, most people believe resistance is useless and are more interested in entertaining themselves, whether it's on social media, through music, entertainment, sport, the list goes on and on. The fact is that every human advance that has been made, not just in Australia, but around the world over thousands of years, has occurred because small groups of committed people have believed, and not only believed, but wanted significant change. Now, public interest before corporate interests is interested in significant change. We're not just interested in reform. And I encourage you to join public interest before corporate interests if you're interested in significant change. There's parliamentary ways of doing things, extra parliamentary ways of doing things. You can meld both strategies together, but ultimately, we are the people we've been waiting for. You can't rely on political leaders, religious leaders, media commentators, corporate executives to fight that battle for you. You are the only one who is capable of change, of pursuing